Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming out on this gorgeous day. My name is Mary D'Elia, and I'm the Health and Wellness Director at the Albany YMCA, located at 921 Keynes Avenue. I realize I never say that. So anyway, in case you don't know where it is, we're on Keynes Avenue. The small Y with a fabulously big heart. In collaboration with the Albany Library, we've been doing this speaker series since 2006. And this month we have a fabulous speaker who is also a member of the Y. I've known Linda for many years. I see her working out on that Stairmaster. And one day somebody said to me, you know, Linda teaches this fabulous class at Ollie, and she's also, you know, quite renowned in her field. So here she is. We're very lucky to have her. So Linda Rugg is a professor in the Scandinavian department at UC Berkeley, where she teaches Scandinavian literature and film. Some of the topics include crime fiction, ecology, culture, children in Scandinavian culture, ethnicity, and race. The plays of August Strindberg and the films of Ingmar Bergman are among other things that she teaches. She's published 2 books, Picturing Ourselves, Photography and Autobiography, and Self-Projection, The Director's Image in Art Cinema. She's also a resident of Albany, and please join me in giving her a warm welcome. Linda Rugg.
Thank you, Mary. I was giving everybody a heart attack because I was a little late. And then I went to the Y. That's a well-worn path from my house to the Y. So I just went there on autopilot, and then they were having a yoga class. And that didn't look like what I was going to do, so I decided to come over here. I got some direction. As Mary said, I teach this. I'm going to stand a little closer to the microphone. I like to move around, so. I teach a course on crime fiction, both for the Ollie program, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, which I can heartily recommend if you aren't a member already, where you can take all kinds of classes, some of which are taught by Cal professors, some of which are taught by people in the community who have areas of expertise. And the crime fiction course I also teach a version of this course to the undergraduates. And it's really interesting to have those 2 different audiences because they come with a whole different perspective on life, you know, attitudes about reading and all kinds of things like that. So I've really enjoyed teaching this course in Ollie. Originally, I was going to come with a PowerPoint presentation and show you pictures, and I thought, no, you know, you really don't need to see any pictures. I'll just talk to you today. And what I want to talk to you about is crime fiction a little bit generally. That is, you know, what is crime fiction? Why do we read it? And so on. And then I'll talk about what happened. Why did the Scandinavians suddenly become so important in crime fiction writing? Because, you know, most of us would imagine that the Scandinavians have a fairly low crime rate, which is true. So why are they such big crime fiction writers, and why have they become so popular as crime fiction writers? So first I'm going to talk just a little bit about, let's see, I'm going to actually maybe turn on this one. Is this one on? Is this one on? No. The mic button here. Hello? No? Hello? Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's always a technical problem. But we've solved that one quickly. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is crime fiction generally. And I also have to make a confession, which is that I am a crime fiction addict. And I have been addicted to crime fiction since I think I was probably 11 or 12 when I found a copy of Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None sort of tucked into my parents' bookshelf, and I snuck it out. And it was a great pleasure for me to read that. And suddenly I realized that there were lots of other books by this person, Agatha Christie. And then from her, I went on to other mostly British crime fiction writers. And I continued to read crime fiction illicitly, that is, when I was supposed to be doing other things. I don't know if any of you have that experience of crime fiction, but I would read it, you know, sort of like candy when I was supposed to be doing Moby Dick, and And then after I was hired here at Cal to be a professor in the Scandinavian department, I realized that I could make a course of it and read it legitimately. And so that's what I did. But if you're going to make a course of something, you have to actually study it and think about it a little bit more deeply than I had up to that point. And so here are some of the things that I've thought about. One is the beginnings of crime fiction. One of the writers that I regularly teach, Henning Mankell, he says, crime fiction has an ancient past. You know, Oedipus stabs out his eyes and all these people are getting killed. And from the beginning of literature in the Bible and everywhere else, we have crimes. But crime depicted in literature is not the same thing as crime fiction. Crime fiction is a very specific kind of genre which deals with the solution of a crime, usually, right? And it has to do with detection. And really, the genre can't get started until there are police. Okay, so crime fiction doesn't really begin as a form of writing until there are people whose job it is to find out about crime. And so the earliest police, you may be shocked to discover, some of you may already know this. That's one of the things about teaching the OLLI audience and teaching an older audience is that they know things that, you know, they know things that I don't know, which is a little scary, but they know a lot, okay? So you may already know that really the first police, informal police in Britain were in the 18th century, in the 1700s. They were called thief takers. Sometimes when they were a little bit more organized, they were called the Bow Street Runners. And really, these guys were almost as much criminals as the people they were catching. And they knew how to catch thieves because they had been thieves. And they knew the neighborhoods, and they knew the people. And sometimes when they were catching thieves, they were also catching their old competitors, you know. And there were lots of really interesting stories about that. And there are actually some crime fiction writers, modern crime fiction writers, who have written about the Bow Street Runners. But that's sort of the early form of policing, and it, you know, I mean, the police always existed a little bit on that line between criminals and upstanding community. They always had to sort of negotiate and know something about both sides of that line. And it's very common, for example, in American crime fiction, that the police are dirty, or that they have, or they're their brothers. The policeman is a good guy, but his brothers are all criminals, or what. All this kind of thing is very common, as they come out of this milieu very often. So in any case, the Bow Street Runners are first, and then it becomes a little bit more formalized during the Napoleonic period, and it's really in France that you have the establishment of the first formal police force, which is the Sécurité, the National Security Force, which was founded by Napoleon. Why does Napoleon want a police force? Partially to keep crime down, but mostly to keep his enemies under his control. So they were kind of spies and kind of policemen, right? And one of the first ones who was a leader of the National Security Force was a man named Vidocq, who had himself been a great criminal, and he became the head of the security force, right? So he knew all the criminals and so on. And so at the same time, and this is in 1812 in Paris, the National Security Force gets founded, and then in the same year in England, the Metropolitan Police are formed in London. And again, this is a period, the Napoleonic period, where there's a lot of spying, there's a lot of things going on. But the Metropolitan Police were formed in response to an increase in street crime and corruption among the private thief takers, right? So they needed something a little bit more institutionalized. So it's around this time, after the Sécurité is formed, that we have our first crime fiction writing, and it is by an American. This is what's usually said. You can contest this, but the person who is imagined to have begun the crime fiction writing genre is Edgar Allan Poe. And he's writing in the 1840s, but he bases everything in France, right? All of his early stories, The Purloined Letter, help me out, Murders in the Rue Morgue. Yeah, this is why I need my notes. So all of these early stories are situated in Paris, and he has a French detective who is sort of loosely kind of based on the Vidocq character, but he has a French detective who is named Dupin, who is really kind of the first one of these detectives who has a sort of supernatural ability to see all these very small details and sort of rationalize and interpret the world in a way that will find a criminal. And there is a police force at the same time, but Dupin is, of course, much more intelligent than they are. And he has a sidekick who is not as intelligent as he is, the Dr. Watson-type sidekick, who sort of writes down all of Dupin's adventures. And it's really Poe who comes up with this idea of what he calls ratiocination, which is the ability to look at details, you know, how the shoe has been worn, what the stain on the finger is like, you know, and this kind of thing, to develop a science of detection. And this is the other thing that is necessary for the beginning of the detective novel, is this idea of detection as a science also. So it's Poe's short stories that sort of paved the way, and he's so interested in placing them in France because that's where the police force got started, that he takes a story that happened in Pennsylvania and puts it in France. Marie Roget, he calls it. Her real name was Mary Rogers. And so Marie Roget, you know, and Dupin solves this murder mystery that was actually solved in Pennsylvania. So Paris was a very important site. And as crime fiction takes off, it's based in part on real crime, on true crime. Some of you may enjoy reading true crime fiction. It's a slightly different genre than fictional crime fiction, but true crime stories was how some of the genre got started out. And one of the persons who wrote true crime stories was Charles Dickens, who was a journalist and would write down what was going on with the Metropolitan Police and all the really awful and gruesome things that were happening. And people loved to read that. So, and part of his novel writing then is based on his experience as an investigative journalist writing about true crime. So if you think about the underworld in David Copperfield or Oliver Twist, to how the pickpockets and the people that he represents, those are people that he became familiar with when he was working as a journalist. So Dickens is another figure who starts out writing about crime but then moves into novelistic discourse. The big person you're probably all familiar with is at the turn of the century, that is A. Conan Doyle, Arthur Conan Doyle, who starts writing the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. But if you're familiar with the history of Poe, you can see that Conan Doyle is really looking at that form for the invention of the Sherlock Holmes figure, who is a scientist, who is a rationalist, right? And well, kind of. He's also an opium eater, but he. And that's another feature of these detectives, is that they often have a tragic flaw. You know, they often have something that makes them, where they're traumatized or where they have some dark past, or it makes them much more fascinating as characters. But in any case, Sherlock Holmes, of course, also has his sidekick, Dr. Watson, who is standing there ready to say to him, you know, how did you figure this out? And then that allows Sherlock Holmes to give this whole bizarre explanation of how he knew the man was a war veteran, and which unit he's fought with because of the way he limped, or whatever it was that he saw. And this has been carried forward. It's such a popular motif that even today there's a BBC series that some of you may be familiar with that involves a Sherlock Holmes figure who is definitely Asperger's syndrome, Asperger's spectrum, you know, and so. But the motif has proven to be so popular that it's still something that we are engaged with today. So this is the way crime fiction developed. And if you'll bear with me for just a little bit further, we have a kind of a bifurcation that takes place in crime fiction after the Second World War. Because there is a form of crime fiction that is very intellectual. It's very much based on science. It's very much based on observation. It's very much based on rational explanation. And it's often performed in an armchair, if not literally, then figuratively. That is, the person is not a gun-toting, kind of person. Instead, this is a person who, like Miss Marple. Okay, so we have Miss Marple, who's an invention of Agatha Christie, who's a snoopy elderly person, which makes her a very good detective. You know, she always knows what's going on in the neighborhood, and she sees everything, right? So Miss Marple is one of Agatha Christie's figures. And just to contrast with the other side with what I'm talking about, you have Mike Hammer. Miss Marple, Mike Hammer, okay? You can already kind of see where I'm going with this, right? So Mike Hammer, as you mentioned, and Mickey Spillane, of course. And so, but there are two different moral universes that are being represented there. And this is what gets kind of interesting when I'm going to mix in the Scandinavian in a second. Because the Miss Marple universe is what the British poet W.H. Auden, who was also a crime fiction addict. Does that make anybody feel better? That W.H. Auden was also a crime fiction. It makes me feel better. But anyway, what he says is that these novels are about what he calls the guilty vicarage, which is, some little place in England, a provincial place in England. Everybody is nice. Everybody knows everybody else. Everybody is in their correct place. Everything is going beautifully. And then a body is found in the library. Okay. So the body in the library or in the vicarage or wherever it's found, right, is an indication that something has gone wrong in a universe that is otherwise beautiful and perfect, right? A moral universe. And the job of the detective is to find that bad apple who upset the order of things and to reinstate the beautiful order that was. Okay, so that is what we would call essentially a conservative model of social representation. That is, we like the hierarchy the way it is. We like to have the nobility here and the working class here, the servants in the servants' quarters, and everybody happy with that. Okay, so, and it's a little bit of a, I'm of course drawing this in grossly broad terms, but it's basically a conservative model that says essentially the world is good. Sometimes a bad person will enter in. If you get rid of that bad person, things will be good again, right? Okay. Mickey Spillane, on the other hand, right? The world is essentially an evil place, right? Don't believe anybody. Women will double cross you. Most women are carrying a gun in their handbag. Okay, and your mother will kill you. It's this kind of universe where at the end of the book, Mickey Spillane has been beaten, tortured, driven, to the last bit of patience he has, and the world is still not any better. Maybe they'll catch the criminal, maybe they won't, but the world is not healed. Okay, so you got that dichotomy, right? Okay, one of those sides is called the whodunit. That's the more intellectual side, and some of us are more drawn to that. And the other side is a thriller or the hard-boiled detective, where the detective himself, usually himself, although there are now female hard-boiled detectives as well, like Warshawski's, where that person is in danger. Right, and that person is threatened, and that person gets beaten up, and terrible things happen to them. So you have these two different worlds that are being depicted in crime fiction, and some readers might be drawn a little bit more to one side, and others might be drawn more to the other side. And there are, of course, books that combine both of these worlds that I can talk about in a second. But there are a couple of different reasons to read detective fictions that are sort of illustrated by the models that I just set up. One of which is, many of us like to solve puzzles. Many of us like to be engaged with the detective and try to figure out, okay, all right, so we have this clue and this might be a false clue. And this clue and this clue, oh, that's definitely a red herring. And this clue, right, and you're trying to stay with the detective. The detective is your point of reference within the narrative. Very often the narrative will be completely focused on the detective's mind, what the detective is experiencing. And you're going along and trying to gather clues along with the detective and figure things out. And it's an intellectual exercise. It can also be suspenseful, but it engages your mind. And then in the thriller, you have a lot of tension, a lot of suspense, you have danger, you have excitement, you have people getting hurt. And we like to read about and watch people getting hurt. It's a thing about us humans. And there are a lot of theories about it. One theory is we like to watch people getting hurt because it's not us when we're watching that. That's actually a theory. Okay. Another theory is it reminds us of our fragility as humans, right? It's one of the things. And then it's also just suspenseful. It creates fear. And we, as the ancients knew about literature, getting your reader to experience fear and excitement is a way of releasing tension. It's a way of getting rid of tension. So if you're addicted to crime fiction, it may be self-medicating. Okay. All right. So what I was supposed to talk about was the Scandinavians and what happens with them. Well, it's very interesting what happens because there's a moment. I'm actually going to distribute this list that I brought with me. And I don't know if I brought enough copies. If I didn't, maybe we could make some more. Maybe I'll take half of those and put on the other side for people to pass back. Yeah, we'll just take it like that. Okay, so because I'm gonna mention some of these people, and their names are so bizarre that you won't be able to imagine how to spell them unless you look, even if you do look at the paper, because the first people I'm going to mention are a husband and wife team who set out very consciously to create a different kind of crime fiction. And their names are Mai Sjöwall and Per Wallö. They're the first people on your list. S-J-W-A-L-L is the woman's name, Sjöwall. And Mai Sjöwall and Per Wallö were Swedes, and they were Marxists, okay? And they were interested, they saw that crime fiction, which depicts the institutions of society and depicts criminal activity, could be used as an instrument for social criticism. This is very Swedish, okay? Sociology and using something in an instrumental kind of way. So they sat down at their kitchen table, Mai Sjöwall and Per Wallö, at night after they put their kids to bed. They had a sketch of 10 novels that they were going to write. They already knew that they were going to write 10 novels. They already knew basically what they were going to be about. And they started writing, and Mai would write one chapter, and sitting across from her, Per would write the other chapter, and then they would switch. And then they would continue writing this way, right? And that was how they wrote 10 novels, the Martin Beck mysteries. And some of you may be familiar with these because this was really the first wave of Scandinavian crime fiction that reached an international audience. They started writing in 1965, and they wrote a book a year until 1975. And then Per unfortunately died just as they were finishing the last book. But they had planned 10 books, and they finished 10 books. And these books are designed to make people think about the ways in which Swedish society had gone wrong. Okay, the Swedish welfare state was supposed to take care of all of its citizens from cradle to grave. It was supposed to make sure that there was order. It was supposed to be oriented towards peace. It was supposed to be oriented towards neutrality. And they felt that the Swedes were getting much too allied with the Americans. See, they were Marxists, right? And they felt that there was much too much capitalism in the mix. There should be less capitalism and more socialism. And so they found lots of different ways to criticize Swedish culture and Swedish society by using the crime fiction genre and their long-suffering, middle-aged, divorced, lonely detective. Does that sound familiar? Have you read any Scandinavian fiction? It was always that guy. That guy, okay, he's the guy. Martin Beck is the first one. He's the prototype for that person. There are a couple of things that I find interesting about this. One thing is that if you recall that traditionally crime fiction upheld conservative values, whether subtly usually, you know, but it was in order to uphold conservative values. This was in order to critique conservative values, right? So they were looking for a revolution in society, much more of a revolution in society. And another element of this is they were very interested in the police procedural, and this is a genre I haven't introduced yet. The whodunit tends to have a lone detective who's usually sometimes working with the police, sometimes working against the police, sometimes better than the police, often, but not part of the police usually. Okay, and the hard-boiled fiction tends to have a private eye, right? Somebody who works on the margins of society. Scandinavians like institutions, and so they put their detective in the police office, okay? And he is a member of the police force, and sometimes this is a good police force and sometimes a little less, but you rarely find the rampant corruption in the police force that you find in American crime fiction. How many dirty cops are there in American crime fiction? We don't have time to list them all right now. It's a very, very common and beloved genre in the United States is the dirty cop or the renegade cop. You know, the police department is all corrupt, so here comes Mr. Renegade Cop to fix the situation. The Scandinavian feeling about this tends to be more that essentially the police are a good institution, and we should uphold them. we should correct their faults, but, you know, they're okay. They're working stiffs like you and me, right? The other aspect of this that's also interesting is that the Scandinavian crime novels tend to depict the criminal not as an evil demon from hell, but a human being whom society has failed. If we had been better people, and if we had built a better society, and if we didn't make the mistakes that we make, this person wouldn't have had to go out and kill 10 people, right? It's really our fault, okay? And we need to fix this problem. It's a very different picture. At the end of the first novel in the My Rival and Paraboleux series, which is called Rosanna, and the murder victim is an American, actually. And Rosanna. And at the end of that novel, the police are sort of meditating on what happened, and they said, we really kind of feel ashamed of ourselves for the way we conducted this case because they hadn't followed all the rules. And they said, we hope no one finds out about how we did this. And man, I feel so sorry for the criminal. That's it. That's like the last part of that's the last chapter. Okay. And it's very, very common that this will be the case. So one of the things that Scandinavian crime fiction did when it was introduced, this was introduced to the United States fairly quickly. The My Rival and Paraboleux series started to be translated in the late 60s. And they're still in print. They were translated into several languages, and they're still in print. And very recently, a BBC television series has been made about them. So they're still popular. They're still interesting. I find that the social critique at points becomes kind of heavy-handed, but they're enjoyable books to read nevertheless. The last book in the series is called The Terrorists. Okay, 1975, there was a wave of terrorism happening in Europe at the time. But what was really chilling about The Terrorists is that My Rival and Paraboleux have the Prime Minister of Sweden assassinated at the end of that book. And when people read it in 1975, they said, okay, that's too far. That's never going to happen, and you people are over the edge, right? Well, it happened in 1986. The same guy who was prime minister in their book who got assassinated was assassinated on the streets of Stockholm. So it's a prescient book, and it's very interesting to read in light of what happened later. Now, after My Rival and Paraboleux, there isn't a huge wave that follows them until 1991. Okay, so they finished writing in 1975. And it causes a big international swell of interest, but it doesn't really produce a lot more Scandinavian crime fiction until 1991. 1991 is the year that Peter Rugg comes out. Peter Rugg is a Dane, and he comes out with a book called Smilla's Sense of Snow, which is a kind of hard-boiled detective thriller, I would say. The protagonist is half Greenlandic and half Danish, so she's a very, very interesting figure, and it goes between Copenhagen and Greenland. And so one of the things about Scandinavian crime fiction for an international audience is that from our point of view, it's an exotic setting, right? Wow, look at how these people live, you know. And it's so the way in which the books are very often very strongly based in a place, and it's a place that's foreign to many readers, has a certain amount of allure. But anyway, Smilla's Sense of Snow was made into a film, and it garnered a lot of interest. And along about the same time, a Swedish woman named Kerstin Ekman came out with a book that was not as popular, but I think is a much better book in a lot of ways, called Blackwater. And Blackwater deals with the far north in Sweden and the Sami people. So there's an interest also in depicting minorities, Scandinavian minorities, the Greenlanders, the Sami. The Sami are the Laplanders, right? That's what their real name is. And so that was one of the things that also made these books kind of interesting. And I found the marketing very interesting too, because when Smilla's Sense of Snow came out, it was one of those covers that's a double cover where you have like a cover that was covered with snow, and then there was a little hole in that first cover that showed a woman's eye peering through the hole, and it was a brown eye because Smilla's part Greenlandic and she was dark. And then Kerstin Ekman's book came out 2 years later and had exactly the same cover, only it was a blue eye. And I thought, okay, the Scandinavians are basically all the same. But sometimes Scandinavian crime fiction, Kerstin Ekman is an important literary author in Sweden, okay? And so is Peter Rugg. Peter Rugg is an important literary author in Denmark. So sometimes the literary quality is kind of high. Not always. I can't promise you that. But sometimes the quality of the literature, the style, is very high. But really the next kickoff for a big wave of Scandinavian fiction comes with Henning Mankell. And Henning Mankell comes from northern Sweden, but he writes about southern Sweden. He writes about a little tiny provincial town called Ystad, is how it's pronounced. It's spelled Y-S-T-A-D, Ystad. And he decides to base his detective fiction in this little tiny provincial town in Ystad, partially, I think, because crime can be more shocking when it happens in a small town, but also because Ystad is a town on the coast that has ferry connections to Eastern Europe, to Poland, to the Baltic states. And so when 1989 comes, there's a huge shift in relationships in Europe, right? And you have this opening of Eastern Europe, and all of a sudden people start to flood Scandinavia coming from the Baltic, right? And this changes some of the culture of Scandinavia. And so that's the new Europe is one of the ways to talk about this, with the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the movement of crime from Eastern Europe into Western Europe. So you have the Russian mafia, you have prostitution, you have human trading, you have all kinds of things like this, right? So these themes have become very important for Scandinavian crime fiction, and Mankell picks up on those right away. The other thing that's really important is immigration, immigration from all around the world. So the Scandinavian countries, especially Sweden, have brought in a large number of immigrants. And if I say a large number of immigrants, it wouldn't be impressive in American terms, but about 20% of the Swedish population is now either an immigrant or has immigrant parents. So that's fairly significant if you thought about 20% of the United States population. So it made a big difference in these countries, and also in how crime was perceived and how crime was depicted. So Mankell's first book is called Faceless Killers, and when one of the victims is on the edge of death, and they're sort of sitting at her bedside trying to get any information they can before she dies, right? And she whispers, "Foreigners." And the police are like, "Oh, God, not that." Because it's going to open a huge can of worms. Like, what does she mean by foreigners? Does she mean Danes, or does she mean Somalis, or what does she mean, And how did she know they were foreign? Were they speaking a foreign language, or were they dark? But because the book goes in that direction, it really opens up all of these questions about what does it mean to be a foreigner in Scandinavia, and what are the social issues surrounding the foreign. Like Maj Sjöwall and Per Wahlöö, Henning Mankell is writing from a leftist perspective. Okay, so he is a leftist social critic. And he's critical of Scandinavian cultural institutions, but he creates a very sympathetic, if somewhat pathetic, detective, Kurt Wallander, who is again divorced, lonely, in his 50s, has terrible time with women, doesn't know how, is alcoholic, what else? Okay, all of those things. He eats too many hot dogs. And now he's being played by Kenneth Branagh, the BBC series, which you may have seen, which I think is a very bizarre thing because it's in English, but they're in Sweden, and there are all these Swedish newspapers that people are reading, and then they speak English, but it's But in any case, he's become very, very popular. So Henning Mankell, I think, with the 12-book Wallander series, the series is now over, okay? You can read the whole thing from start to finish. It's done. He won't be able to go any farther. I won't tell you why, because that would be a spoiler. But around that time, then, there's a real blast of Scandinavian crime fiction. And I would like to just say that it's because Scandinavian crime fiction is so great. But that's only part of the explanation, right? It has to do with the publishing world, right? You have a hit where you're selling a lot of books, and it's like, okay, where can we get the next one of these? That's what they're always looking for. They're looking for the next one. So the Scandinavians have great luck in marketing their detective fiction abroad. not so much their poetry, right? Okay, so it's the detective fiction that has caught fire, and so author after author has now entered the market, and so I'm going to run through just a few of them, and also I want to give you a chance to ask a couple questions. So I've written up short descriptions of these people, but this just gives you an idea of the sweep and the range and the number. I mean, we're talking about a huge number of books, and we're talking about small populations producing them, right? Sweden is the biggest country population-wise. There are 9 million Swedes, okay? There are about that many people living in the greater Los Angeles area, okay? And Sweden is the size of California, approximately, so that gives you an idea. Norway has 5 million. Denmark has 5 million, okay? And about 5 million in Finland. Iceland has 375,000. It's the size of Omaha, Nebraska, okay, population-wise. But they have great crime fiction. They're great readers, and they're really good writers also. Okay, so I'm just going to mention a few names. I'm going to be picky. Karin Fossum is one of my personal favorites, a Norwegian crime writer. She has a detective who fits the stereotype that we were just describing, so I don't have to go through those characteristics again. He does have a girlfriend, however, and he has a dog that's named after one of the characters in the My Huerval and Pervaleux series. It's Martin Beck's best friend. Her detective's dog is named after Martin Beck's best friend. So you know that they read each other, right? She has an emphasis on psychology. She herself knew a murder victim when she was a young girl, and she saw what happened to the whole group of people surrounding that murder victim. So she was interested in the psychology of crime and the impact that it has. Håkan Nesser is an interesting outlier because he doesn't write about crime fiction that's based in Sweden, even though he's a Swede. He invents this country and invents this town, and it looks an awful lot like Holland. And so he's a little different. I included a Finn Harry Nikkanen. He has a Jewish detective. There are very, very few Jewish Finns. But he has a Jewish detective named Kafka. Yeah, and it's a pretty good book, though. That's why I liked it. One of my favorites is the Icelander Arnaldur Indridason. He has a detective who fits the model, divorced, unhappy, and so on and so forth, really bad diet. But he's written 11 novels, Erlander novels, and he too really, what happens in these series is that you can tell that they've planned a series, because in the first books they'll sort of plant the seeds of something, a relationship or hints at the dark past of the detective, right? And as you read along in the series, you find out more and more, and you're like, oh yeah, that's why he has this obsession, you know, with lost children books, right? So there are things like that that happen in series where you almost have to treat the series as a single work. And I don't like to jump into the middle of a series. So I've recommended some of my favorite books here, but some of them are in the middle of a series. But if you don't like to go in the middle, you should go from the beginning. But anyway, Iceland is a place that many of us haven't had the opportunity to visit, or unless we just stopped over with Iceland Air back in the heyday. And so he really gives us a sense of Icelandic culture. Jo Nesbø, he's the rock star of the Scandinavian detective writing world. He literally is a rock star. He's a lead singer for a rock group. But he has created this detective with the unfortunate name Harry Hole, which is pronounced Harry Hole in English. And he must have done that on purpose, but because he knows English. But he has very violent crime novels, and he's one of the exceptions to the Scandinavian rule that I mentioned earlier, where I said that essentially the Scandinavians like their institutions and portray them as basically positive. In his books, the Oslo Police Department is just as corrupt as the New York Police Department. You know, it's Chicago, it's terrible. And so Harry Hole is an outlier. He's a renegade cop. Many of you know Stig Larsson. He created an enormous wave right around 2006-07 with the Millennium Trilogy, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and The Girl Who Played with Fire. These are not translations of the Swedish titles, by the way. The first book, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, is called in Swedish Men Who Hate Women. Yeah. Okay. So And he really wanted to keep that title, and the people who were marketing it said, no, Girl with a Dragon Tattoo is better. But you can see when you read the book that he's very much interested in violence against women, and that's also a theme that runs through a lot of the Scandinavian crime fiction, violence against women, but also violence against children. And if you think about it, if you know the Stieg Larsson books, he's very critical of Swedish welfare state institutions. Also, he's writing from the left. He was an investigative journalist who was interested in tracing extremist right groups in Sweden. That's why he has Nazis in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, neo-Nazis and Nazis. So he creates this world in which the social welfare system has failed utterly in protecting this young woman, Lisbeth Salander. She is a ward of the state, and the person who's been placed in charge of her rapes her and takes financial advantage of her and so on. So he too is one of these people who wants to write crime fiction to show the flaws in the welfare state and to see whether there are ways that they could be improved. One of the things that's very funny, if you are someone who knows Swedish culture, you immediately recognize that The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is based on Pippi Longstocking. There are many, many clues, and he himself says this in an interview, and you think, really? Pippi Longstocking with the braids? No. Yeah, she's based on Pippi Longstocking. Another one of my favorite teams is Lars Kepler. And they've come out now with a couple of titles in English. It's a husband and wife team. And they, for some reason, have a Finnish detective in Stockholm. So a Finn, the mysterious Finn, Joona Linna, is their detective. And he's a very interesting figure. And very often, whether or not we like a detective series will depend on whether or not we can relate to the detective, you know. And you're saying, well, I can't really relate to Wallander. He's like this, you know. But you have empathy or sympathy, or you have some understanding for the detective, and this allows you to be captivated by the work. If you don't like the detective, you're probably not going to read the series. You need to really feel like you can identify with this person, because you're going to be spending all your time with him or her, right? You know, it's like in the car with Wallander to another hamburger restaurant, you know. So you have to be willing to do that. Joona Linna is a really interesting person to spend time with. And he's kind of what the Swedish stereotype of a Finn is, which I can't really describe to you unless you read the book. The silent Finn, I guess I could say. Here's another team, is Lena Kåbebøl and Agneta Friis. They are Danes. And what I find interesting about their series is that they use a Red Cross nurse as their detective, and she's got OCD really bad. Like, she has to check the clock every 2 seconds, which can get a little boring after a while for the reader. But she's a bad mom, you know, great. She has a great husband who takes care of the kids, and she's a terrible mom. And but she's, in any case, an interesting figure to follow. And what interests me about this is that there are certain professions that are closely allied with detective work. One is the journalist, and you have a journalist detective in Stieg Larsson's trilogy, the Millennium Trilogy. But another, doctors and nurses, because doctors and nurses are trained to look at symptoms and to try to find out what the history of a disease is, right? So these professions are often placed, you know, if you have, for example, the coroner in so many detective fiction now, the coroner is a very important person. So they need journalists to have this sort of social networking, and they need doctors to help them with finding the genetic clues very often nowadays. So anyway, I can recommend these novels. They also deal very, very much with the New Europe. And then I have a little list of things that I threw down there of people that you might also look at. And as I write at the top of this list, it's very subjective. Whether or not you like a detective series depends so much on who you are and what appeals to you. There are certain, I mean, I am actually, I have to confess, not a huge fan of the Stieg Larsson books, but that's me. A lot of other people are totally captivated by them. And there was a period when I would be anywhere in a public place, I would see someone reading one of these books. And for someone who does Scandinavian literature as a profession, it was like, yes, please read them, you know. Someone will know where Stockholm is. And now people are going on tours to Stockholm, and even there are tourists who go to Ystad, this little tiny town in southern Sweden, to see where Kurt Wallander lives, right? There are big buses of Japanese tourists looking at Kurt Wallander's house. So it's been great for Scandinavia. It's been great. We had what we called the Stieg Larsson phenomenon, where our enrollments went boom, and we even had like twice as many people enrolled in Swedish. They wanted to learn Swedish because they'd read Stieg Larsson, which to me was completely incomprehensible, but I'll take it if they want to come. So I wanted to give you a chance to ask a couple questions before we have to wrap up here. Yes?
You said at the beginning that, or you made the observation that there's a low crime rate in many of these countries, but such an interest in fiction. What's your theory about that?
My main theory about it is that I think that the Scandinavians, as a general rule, there are two things that characterize Scandinavian literature from my point of view, having read a lot of it. And one is that they're very, very interested in confrontations with darkness. So whatever is out there that scares you or is, the most terrifying thing you can think of, that's the thing they're going to want to write about. Okay, that's why we have August Strindberg. That's why we have Ingmar Bergman. That's why because there's something about a confrontation with the deepest kinds of fears that one can imagine that really is part of Scandinavian tradition. The other thing is what I was talking about a little bit is the interest in the perfectibility of the human being. How can we perfect human society? And one of the best ways to do it is to critique human society. Never let anyone get away with a mistake. Try to design things so that no one will fall through the cracks. And the crime fiction is designed to show what happens when you design something that doesn't work well, right? So an example would be Arnaldur Indriðason's first novel, Jar City, which I can very highly recommend. And some of you may know that Iceland, which has a very small population and with a past that's been very well recorded, has been used as a genetic laboratory because they know who all these people related to and where they came from, and there has been very little immigration into Iceland. So they have this sort of little laboratory sitting in the North Atlantic where they can study inherited diseases. But what happened that was very controversial was that the Icelandic parliament, the Althing, decided to sell that information to a private company so that the private company would do research on, and it's like, oh, don't worry, everyone will be anonymous. It's going to be all hidden and no one will know and no one will be able to deny you, whatever. And a lot of Icelanders objected to this, including Indriðason. And he wrote this novel with the hypothetical, what would happen if someone abused this system? What would happen if someone committed a crime abusing the system? So this is a very typical kind of Scandinavian reason to write crime fiction, not because there's lots of crime, but because crime could reveal the flaws in the system that we need to fix. And also, guilt is assigned liberally to everyone. So, yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. She was saying, some of you might not be able to hear, she said, well, I just found the Stieg Larsson books way too graphic for my taste. And as I was saying at the beginning of the talk, we tend to divide into people who are interested in crime fiction for more intellectual reasons and people who really enjoy the suspense and some of the violence. And yes, there are some other people on this list that you should avoid. Jo Nesbø among the first of these. He's unbelievably violent. But what I would like to say about that also is that, I don't know if the rest of you have noticed this, if some of you are crime fiction readers, but crime fiction has become progressively more violent. I mean, no one could dream of some of the stuff that's come up with in contemporary crime fiction. And the interest in the human body that you have in a series like CSI, Crime Scene Investigation, where the main interest is on forensic evidence. What happens then to the human body is that it becomes like an object. It becomes a thing to be dissected that's made up of component parts but is not really fully a human being. And for many of us, that's not the most important part of crime fiction. For many of us, psychology is more important, right? But crime fiction has sort of drifted toward, partially because of interest in genetics and genetic evidence, but for other reasons as well. It's become more violent and more interested in the body and less interested in the mind. But even with some of these that are very violent, there can be very interesting psychological things going on, like the Lars Kepler books are quite violent. But I think they're interesting psychologically, so, yeah.
Channel 54 has been running mysteries, and one of the best ones, I think, is the Investigator in the Sea, the Swedish one, where the detective is a German. And he really is a rapid turnover in his family and the whole bit. It seems to be so realistic, and you have the English subtitles, so you can almost pick up some Swedish too.
He was talking about Channel 54, which many of my students mentioned to me, where they run foreign crime fiction, and this was called Investigator from the Sea. Inspector in the Sea. Inspector in the Sea. It's in German.
No, it's in Swedish.
Oh, okay. I don't know it, so I can't. But basically, what I think the takeaway here too is that there's a lot of things on television and film, and some very important television programs, for example, like The Bridge, which is a Danish-Swedish co-production, which deals with the bridge that goes between Sweden and Denmark. That one is a very, very good one. Pardon? It's not on a channel. You'd probably have to rent it because, yeah. But they did an American remake. There's an American remake, The Bridge. I'm not sure what bridge they're using. I think it might be El Paso, but that would change it a little bit. It's over the Rio Grande. Yes, thank you. So, it's a very common American practice to pick up on these popular things and make an American version of it. So, yeah. But these ones that he was talking about are foreign. They're foreign series, and there are quite a lot of them. Yeah. We'll go you and then you. Sorry.
It seems like Scandinavian mysteries at this point are generally very violent, at least those that I've read, and I wonder, are there kind of cozy Scandinavian
Okay, so I was asked about the cozy Scandinavian mystery. I think that probably of the ones that I'm listing here, Karin Fossum would be one, which is relatively focused on the psychology. For example, the book that I recommend, The Indian Bride, there's a very brutal murder that takes place early in the book, but then we just leave the body behind, and they're not repeated murders. Very, very frequently in all crime fiction, I would say it's not only Scandinavian crime fiction, but all crime fiction, American, and if you think about the film Seven, or they're very, 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 very violent. And it's common that there will be repeated murder because you have to keep the audience, excited, and who's going to get killed next, and the police have to work against the clock and all this thing. But Karin Fossum tends to work dealing with something that happened early on, and she doesn't, it's usually not a serial situation. She's the one that probably fits the cozy bill the best of these. And yeah, I mean, My Equivalent Pervaleux, the earlier series, is not as violent as later series, but I think that's because of the development that takes place in crime fiction. Yeah. I had someone in the very back. You. Yeah. Uh-huh. What's it called? A Eagle, and and that's Comcast? Okay. Comcast Channel 17. I don't have cable, so my students will say, "Oh, look at this," and yeah.
I've also noticed, and I wonder about this. I mean, it's not just, I don't think, in Scandinavian mystery stories, but the people who are detectives, their relationships are always falling apart because they're so busy. I mean, their jobs are so demanding.
Yeah.
But it seems to be more the case in these Scandinavian.
Yeah, she was mentioning the how the detective's family is often falling apart, and how you very rarely have an intact marriage or a happy marriage, and that's true. There are a few exceptions to that rule. Helena Tursten's detective has this great husband who's a chef and cooks the food and takes care of the girls, and so does Lena Carbot. Yeah, but so the women detectives tend to have good husbands. Yeah, but the men detectives are just like no. But I think that what they argue very frequently is that this is actually a social reality, that divorce is very common among people in this kind of field, and so they're trying to depict realistically what that might be like in a relationship, and yeah, so you do have a lot of broken homes and so on. Yeah. Yeah. Elizabeth Sander, yeah.
Good characters, good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But the writing is so miserable. Why? Is that just English translation?
Yeah, it's funny because what he was saying, I don't know if all of you heard him, he said, that the Millennium books have really strong characters, especially Lisbeth Salander is a really amazing, compelling character, and they have interesting stories, and there's like this sort of dark past thing as well circulating in the series, but the writing is not good. And I can say that the writing is not great in Swedish, but it really was not helped by a lousy English translation. The English translation, and the thing is that the guy who translated it, and I know him, refused to put his name on the translation because when he was rushed through the translation, and they didn't give him a chance to go back. And so the first book in the series especially is completely riddled with weird errors. So like if you're reading it in English, you go, oh, I think I know what they meant to say, but that was not it. So yeah, and it's verbose. It's very verbose, right? So the books themselves were not edited. I mean, in Swedish, they weren't edited either. They're much, much fatter than a lot of the detective crime fiction. But part of the issue is that this is not part of the issue with the translation is that he died before they were issued in English, so he didn't see them in translation at all. Yeah. Are there any other questions? No one's going to ask me about alcoholism? Thank you. No, you're not asking me about alcoholism. Yeah.
I'm willing to see that Pippi Longstocking had been failed by the state and so forth, but Liz Salander?
Oh, Lisbeth Salander, yeah. Well, Lisbeth, do you mean, you don't see the relationship between the two of them? Is that what you're saying? Or?
Well, I'm kind of intrigued by why
they're... She was intrigued by the idea that Lisbeth Salander was linked to Pippi Longstocking. One of the reasons that Pippi Longstocking is so important as a children's narrative is that you have this child who doesn't have any parental supervision, right, and who lives alone, and who is very, very strong, who's sort of supernaturally strong. Remember how she picks up her horse, and Lisbeth Salander is a boxer. Right, and she doesn't have parents, and she has to live on her own, and she also, Pippi Longstocking refuses to go to school, doesn't have anything to do with institutional practices, disrupts school for the other children, and so Lisbeth Salander follows that model, and there are little hints that get dropped in the book, like at one point, Lisbeth Salander lives in this really fantastic apartment that she buys with the money that she got from the first book. I hope that's not too much of a spoiler. But anyway, she buys this magnificent Stockholm apartment in this amazing neighborhood. And when the journalist goes to ring her bell, you see her name in Sweden, the names are usually placed by the mail opening on the door. And her name is given as V. Villekulla. And Pippi Longstocking's home, where she lived, was called Villa Vallekulla. So she lives at Pippi Longstocking's house. So it's that kind of, lots and lots of those are sprinkled in the book. And also her partner, the journalist, Mika Berggren, that's one of Pippi Longstocking's buddies is named that. So there are lots of hints that she's supposed to be a latter-day Pippi Longstocking. Yeah. I think we've come to a time when we're supposed to close. So thank you for your attention. And if you have any other questions, you can ask.